Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Old Testament in the Raw. I don't know if you noticed it in the last video, but I actually had a few things on a slide that I showed, and I didn't actually talk about it, so I want to come back and talk about the Tanak and the Septuagint, or the LXX. I'll throw this slide back up on here so you can see it. This is where I skipped over this part. I totally skipped over it. And it has to do with, well, this whole section here. How many books are in the Old Testament? 39. Boring. Who cares? You can Google that. No big deal. But what is meant by Tanak versus the LXX? So I want to explain that just briefly here before we jump into an overview of the Old Testament in the next video. So what is Tanak? Sometimes it's written out like just T-N-K, and sometimes you'll see the A's, the vowels added in there just so you can pronounce it. Well, the Tanakh is an acronym, stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Okay, so Torah, and then Nevi'im. There's various ways you can transliterate this. These are Hebrew words, by the way, written out in English, and then Ketuvim. And all this means is, I mean, there's various ways to translate this. Some people might say the law, prophets, and then the writings. Okay, Ketuvim, the writings. Sorry for my terrible handwriting here. It's kind of hard to write on this little iPad thing here. So Torah, the law, or sometimes it's translated, probably a better translation is instruction or teaching. Torah stands for the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Okay, the Nevi'im, the prophets, stands for the next section of the Hebrew Old Testament. Okay, so Joshua, Judges, and according to the Hebrew arrangement, it doesn't include Ruth here, so it goes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and then Kings. And in the original Hebrew Bible, Samuel was one book, Kings was one book. And then it goes on to our traditional prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets. Now, if you noticed, you might have said, wait, you missed out on a few, and that was deliberate because they're not included in Daniel, for instance, in our English Bibles, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then Daniel, but Daniel is not included under the prophets. Daniel is actually under the Ketuvim, the writings. Who else? Yeah, Ruth is included in the writings. Ruth is not included under the prophets. Also in our English Bibles, after Kings, we go straight to Chronicles, which is kind of like another retelling of the Hebrew history. In the Hebrew arrangement, Chronicles is included under the writings, along with, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and various other books. So TNK, the Tanakh, describes the Hebrew arrangement of the Old Testament. The Old Testament as it was arranged by the original Hebrew people, okay, or Jewish people. How is that different from the LXX? Well, first of all, we have to understand what LXX is even referring to. So LXX simply means 70. And according to tradition, 70 bilingual scholars around the year 200 BC, they started to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And this is probably for 2 reasons. Number one, a lot of Jewish people were speaking Greek and could not speak Hebrew anymore, so they needed to read their scriptures in the language they can understand. Okay, and another reason why it was translated into Greek is because you had some Gentiles that were becoming fascinated with the kind of the mysterious Hebrew scriptures, and so they wanted to read the scriptures on their own, according to tradition. We're not sure exactly how it all went down, but we do know around the year 200 BC, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. So it's often referred to as the Septuagint. I'm hoping I'm spelling this right. You can Google it. My spelling's pretty garbage right now, and I guess I got to move my screen. You can move my face out of the way there. Septuagint. So why does this matter? Well, what's interesting is that most quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament, like when you see like Paul and even the gospel writers quoting the Old Testament, most of the time They're quoting from the Septuagint. And we know this because there are some differences between the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, I think, there's one of two mistakes you can make. One would be to say that there's so many differences that these are completely different versions of the Old Testament. That would be one mistake. There's a lot of commonality between the Septuagint and the Tanak. The other mistake would be to say, oh, they're exactly the same. Like when we're reading the Septuagint, you're reading word for word the same that you would read if you're reading in Hebrew. Well, that's not true either. There are some differences, especially in books like the book of Jeremiah has a lot of differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible. Now, our English Bibles are arranged according to the Septuagint, the order that I said earlier, where it's like Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then it goes Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and it goes in the Chronicles. So that's that arrangement. The English arrangement follows the Septuagint, but the English translations of the Old Testament are based, almost all of them are based on the Hebrew Old Testament. In fact, they're based on a manuscript that dates back to around 1000 AD called the Masoretic Text. And that's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy all the way back down to tracing it all the way back to the original writing of the Old Testament. Okay, so the English arrangement follows the Greek translation. Okay, but our English translations are actually drawing from the Hebrew translation of the Old Testament. Okay, so I just want to come back and talk about that, the weird kind of Tanakh and LXX there to explain why I originally wrote that there and totally skipped over it in my previous video. For the next time, we're actually going to take a broad overview of the entire Old Testament, get a look at the forest before we dive into looking at the trees.